Before we dive deeper into these chilling tales, I want to take a moment to connect with you, my listeners. Wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's a cozy living room, your car on a late-night drive, or your bed with the covers pulled up, I want you to drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible to think that while we're all in different places, experiencing life in our own unique ways, we're here together, sharing this moment. Stories have this beautiful way of reminding us that even though our lives may seem so different, we're more alike than we realize. So let's connect. Tell me where you're from, and let's show that no matter where we are in the world, we all share the same curiosity for the unknown. We're not so different after all.
There's a stretch of road outside of New Mexico known as Route 89. To most, it's just another highway cutting through the desert, barren and endless. But for those who've lived nearby, it's called something else. The Vanishing Mile. It's a place people avoid, especially at night. This is the story of why. In the summer of 2006, Darren and Mia Carter, a young married couple, were moving cross-country from Los Angeles to Dallas. They packed up their SUV and took the long, scenic route, hoping to turn the move into an adventure. Darren was a photographer, so they made frequent stops for him to capture the landscapes. Everything was fine until their GPS rerouted them onto Route 89. It was late in the afternoon when they turned onto the two-lane highway. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows over the empty road. There were no signs, no landmarks, just miles of desolate desert. "This can't be right," Mia said, frowning at the map on her phone. "There's nothing out here." Darren shrugged. "It's probably a shortcut. We'll save time." For the first hour, the road seemed normal. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The desert became eerily quiet, and the headlights illuminated nothing but an endless stretch of asphalt. Then, the radio began to static. Mia fiddled with the dial, trying to tune in a station, but all she got was a faint, warbling voice. "What's wrong with it?" Darren asked. I don't know, it's like it's picking up something else." The voice on the radio grew louder, but the words were unintelligible, a distorted mix of whispers and faint crying. Uneasy, Mia turned it off. That's when they saw the first sign of trouble. A car on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. "Should we stop?" Mia asked. Darren slowed the SUV but kept a cautious distance. Something about the scene felt off. The car's driver's door was wide open, but there was no one inside. On the ground nearby, a scattering of personal items, a purse, a phone, a child's toy, lay abandoned. "Hello?" Darren called out through the open window. No answer. Just the sound of the wind. Mia urged him to keep driving, and he agreed. As they pulled away, Darren glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, staring after them. He didn't say anything to Mia, not wanting to scare her, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. A few miles later, their headlights caught something in the distance. Another car. This one was overturned, smoke curling from its engine. Again, there were no people, just more scattered belongings. "This is getting weird," Mia whispered. Darren nodded, his pulse quickening. "We'll find the next exit and get off this road." But there was no exit. Route 89 stretched on endlessly, with no signs, no turnoffs, and no other roads. One, Arnie thought, as he opened the vehicle. He looked around and saw a gap between the front and rear seats. After another hour, their fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. The stress was wearing on them, and the sense of isolation was unbearable. That's when the headlights began to flicker. And it was then that Minaltus saw Ivy and the girl playing poker in the bow. Ignoring his heavy heart, he drove carefully off the road. "Darren," Mia's voice was trembling now. "I know," he said, trying to stay calm. "It's just the battery. We'll be fine." But the headlights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The car coasted to a stop, and Darren tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "We're stranded," Mia whispered. They sat in the suffocating silence, the vast emptiness pressing in on them. Darren pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, not even emergency service. "We have to walk," he said. "There's no other choice." Reluctantly, they grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cool desert air. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the road ahead and the occasional shadowy movement in the distance. As they walked, Mia noticed something strange. Darren, the stars. He looked up, and she was right. The night sky, which had been full of stars just moments ago, was now a void, an impenetrable blackness stretching infinitely. Exercise. Then came the footsteps. Huh! They started faintly, a soft crunching sound on the asphalt behind them. Darren whipped around, shining the flashlight, but there was nothing there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if something unseen was following them. "Hello?" Darren shouted. "Who's there?" No answer, just the relentless sound of footsteps. They started running, the flashlight bouncing wildly, but no matter how fast they moved, the footsteps matched their pace. Then, ahead of them, a light appeared, faint but steady. It was a gas station, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Relief flooded them as they stumbled toward it, but as they got closer, their hope turned to dread. The gas station looked abandoned, its windows shattered, the sign flickering erratically. Inside, the shelves were empty, covered in dust. A single payphone hung on the wall, but when Darren picked it up, there was no dial tone. Then they heard it. A low, guttural voice whispering their names. Mia screamed, and Darren grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back door. They burst outside and froze. The road was gone. In its place was a vast empty void, a black expanse that seemed to pulse and breathe. The gas station was now floating in this nothingness, an island of decay. And then they saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the void, their hollow eyes fixed on Darren and Mia. The couple backed into the gas station, slamming the door shut. But the figures didn't stop. They pressed against the glass, their faces distorted and shifting. "Darren," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" He didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew the truth. There's a forest in northern Maine called Black Hollow Woods. Local legend says that it's cursed, a place where the lines between this world and something darker blur. People go in, but they don't always come out. And those who do, they're never quite the same. This is the story of what happened to Eric Daniels, a 33-year-old hiker who thought the tales were just folklore. He followed his old trail mate, Daniels' outfitter Rupert Collins, to the spot where the passes ran off the main trail. Eric was an experienced outdoorsman who had hiked some of the most challenging trails across the United States. To him, Black Hollow Woods was just another destination, a chance to explore something remote and untouched. He'd read about it online, a forest with a reputation for being haunted. Local reports described strange noises, bizarre symbols carved into trees, and, most chilling of all, sightings of people standing motionless, deep in the woods, staring into nothingness. "Ah, sounds like a tourist trap," Eric said to himself as he packed his gear. He arrived at the trailhead on a chilly October morning. The air was crisp, and the forest loomed before him, a dense wall of dark pines and tangled undergrowth. The weathered wooden sign read, "Enter at your own risk." "Want dramatic," Eric muttered, snapping a picture for his Instagram before heading in. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the sound of his boots crunching against the dirt path. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Eric noticed something odd. The trail, which had been well marked, seemed to disappear. The trees grew denser, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out the light. He checked his map and GPS, but both were useless. The map didn't match his surroundings, and the GPS showed him spinning in circles. Reaching up with one hand, "That's weird," he muttered, trying to shake off the unease creeping over him. As night fell, Eric decided to set up camp. He cleared a small area, pitched his tent, and lit a fire. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows across the trees. "I'm afraid I have to get back to work," Eric said. While eating his dinner, he heard it. A faint humming sound, low and rhythmic, coming from deeper in the woods. "Exercise," he said softly. Probably the wind, he told himself, though it didn't sound like the wind. He tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. Then, in the distance, he saw them. 3 faint lights, bobbing slowly between the trees. Eric froze, his heart pounding. He reached for his flashlight and shone it toward the lights, but they vanished instantly. "Okay," he said, standing up. "Not funny, whoever you are." The forest swallowed his voice. That night, Eric barely slept. He woke repeatedly to the sound of footsteps circling his tent. Every time he unzipped it and looked out, there was nothing but darkness. By morning he was exhausted, but determined to press on. He packed up his gear and resumed hiking, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Around midday, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. A clearing with a single massive oak tree in the center. Carved into its bark were dozens of symbols, circles, spirals, and jagged lines. At the base of the tree lay a pile of objects: old shoes, broken watches, rusted knives. Eric took a step closer, and that's when he saw it. A Polaroid photo sticking out of the dirt. He picked it up and flipped it over. It was a picture of him, standing at the trailhead, from that morning. His stomach dropped. He hadn't seen anyone all day. "Who the hell?" he began, but a rustling sound cut him off. All 4 of him joined together in the same exclamation, speaking constantly at the same time. He turned and saw them again, 3 lights hovering at the edge of the clearing. Eric ran. He didn't care about the trail or the map anymore. He just wanted to get out. The lights followed him, weaving through the trees like they were alive. The forest seemed to shift around him, the path narrowing and twisting in impossible ways. He tripped over roots and scraped his arms on branches, but he kept going. Slowly, finally he burst into another clearing, gasping for breath. "One tail." But this one wasn't empty. In the center stood a stone well, ancient and moss-covered. A figure crouched beside it, their back to Eric. "Hey," Eric shouted, desperate for help. The figure didn't move. As he got closer, he realized the figure wasn't crouching. It was bent backward, its limbs twisted unnaturally. "Stay back," Eric said, his voice shaking. The figure slowly turned its head toward him, and Eric felt his legs go weak. Its face was wrong. Too long, too pale, with empty black holes where the eyes should be. It opened its mouth, and the humming sound poured out, deafening and unrelenting. Now, Eric stumbled back, tripping over a root. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not stopping until he saw the faint outline of the trailhead through the trees. When he finally emerged from Black Hollow Woods, he collapsed beside his car, trembling and covered in scratches. He drove straight home, vowing never to speak of what happened. But the next morning, when he checked his phone, there was a new picture in his gallery. The well, and standing beside it was the twisted figure staring directly at the camera. If you've ever driven through the small, unmarked towns of rural Oregon, you've probably passed by Pine Haven without realizing it. It's the kind of place that doesn't appear on most maps, a forgotten little dot in the middle of nowhere. But what Pine Haven lacks in charm, it makes up for in one thing: its stories. And the most chilling of all is about the Whispering Woods. Everything relies on it. When Amy Reinhard moved to Pine Haven after her divorce, she wasn't looking for adventure. She just wanted a fresh start. The little town seemed perfect. Quiet streets, friendly faces, and a library where she'd quickly found a job. But what she didn't know was that Pine Haven had a rule no one talked about. You don't go near the woods. Amy first heard the warnings as passing remarks, the way you might mention avoiding a pothole. Stay clear of the trees, they'd say. Nothing good comes from there. But it wasn't until her first week in town that she realized people were dead serious. It started on an ordinary jog. Amy liked to run in the evenings, and Pine Haven's trails were perfect for clearing her head. That night, her route took her close to the woods. She was mid-stride when she heard it. A faint voice carried on the wind. "Morty." She froze, pulling out her earbuds. The voice came again, faint but clear, like a child calling for help. Amide. Her heart raced. Who could possibly know her name? Against her better judgment, she stepped closer to the tree line, scanning the shadows for movement. "Hello? Who's there?" But the only answer was the sound of the wind through the trees. Feeling uneasy, she turned and ran back to town. But the voice followed her home. That night, Amy couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she swore she could hear her name whispered from the direction of the woods. The next morning, she told herself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, an overactive imagination. But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next few days, Amy began to notice strange things around her house. Doors she was sure she'd locked were left slightly ajar. Her keys disappeared, only to reappear in odd places. One night, she found muddy footprints leading from her back door to her bedroom window. Desperate for answers, Amy started digging into the town's history. What she found was disturbing. A series of disappearances stretching back decades, all linked to the woods. Entire families had vanished, their homes left as if they'd stepped out for a moment and never returned. At the library, Amy discovered an old journal written by a man named Henry Mercer. It detailed the experiences of a logging community that once thrived near Pine Haven, until the whispers began. "They call you by name," Henry wrote. "They know your thoughts, your fears, and once they have you, they never let go." His last entry read, "If you hear them, it's already too late." Amy couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching her. She started seeing things in her peripheral vision, shadows darting between the trees, faint glows in the darkness. One evening, she recorded the sounds outside her window, hoping to prove she wasn't imagining things. When she played it back, her blood ran cold. Among the rustling leaves and chirping crickets were voices, many voices, whispering her name. But what terrified her most was hearing her own voice whispering back, "Bye, too." Unnoticed, her companions had descended. The pull of the woods grew stronger. Amy began sleepwalking, waking up in the middle of the night at the edge of the forest with no memory of how she got there. She started losing time, finding hours missing from her days. One stormy night, unable to fight the pull any longer, Amy ventured into the woods with a flashlight. The whispers guided her, deeper and deeper, until she reached a clearing bathed in an unnatural light. At the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk carved with strange symbols. Around it lay objects, photographs, toys, jewelry, offerings from those who had come before her. The shadows moved closer, forming a circle around her. Their voices rose in unison, a deafening chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Amy dropped to her knees, her flashlight flickering out as the figures surrounded her. The next morning, Amy's car was found parked near the woods. Her house was locked, her belongings untouched. She was never seen again. Brandon wondered. The people of Pine Haven don't talk about Amy Reinhardt, just like they don't talk about the Whispering Woods. But sometimes, on quiet nights, you might hear a voice carried on the wind, a voice calling for help, or perhaps calling someone's name.